afternoon, Chapel. Hey, nisalimieni bana. Good afternoon, Chapel. Tell the person next to you, relax. I am the one on the hot seat, not you. Relax. Let me be the one who is tense. But thank you so much, and thank you, Pastor Nick, for the invitation here. As I was introduced, media is a thing that I am passionate about, and that intersection of faith and culture, for me, is the thing that fascinates me the most. If you've ever heard me talk about this before, I talk about how media shapes narratives, and whether it's tobacco or climate change, whatever it is. But media does have some sort of role to play. And today, what I really want to do, because I find the LGBT story forget even faith, from a storytelling and narrative perspective, such a fascinating story. I am really fascinated by the story and the narrative of it. And I want to share a little bit of that with you. Now, I want to start, if you guys will allow me, 100 years ago. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Guys who didn't like history, please just relax, even you. 100 years ago. And I want to talk a little bit about the gay rights movement and the history of it over the past 100 years. And I'll be quick with it. Now, disclaimer is that a lot of this narrative comes from North America. The reason for that is because they have been the dominant culture of this age, especially in as far as media, entertainment, and all of that is concerned. Secondly, is because the movement really has been birthed from there to the rest of the world, and they have influenced the thinking. So, but they're also the ones who've documented it the best. So that's just a disclaimer as I go through this. So, 1920s, if you're happy for me to start there. 1920s is really when the gay rights movement began to consolidate as a movement. I'm sure there's been conversation all throughout history. There's nothing new under the sun. But in terms of documented movements, it's around the 1920s that various movements began to spring up. Now, they were very fringe movements, on the fringes of society completely. But what they did, and what they tried to focus on, was influencing government and government policy. So what they would do is picket and lobby governments and lobby agencies, for gay rights. But they made very, very little impact through the first, couple of decades of doing that. However, around the 70s, just at the end of the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s, the narrative changed so significantly, so quickly. Three things happened. Try track with me. First thing happened in 1969 in New York, in a village called Greenwich Village. There was a pub there called the Stonewall Inn. Now, this was a gay pub. And what would happen is that the police would often raid pubs like this for a number of reasons, but one of them was also because a lot of gay pubs were used as fronts by the mafia. And you can read about this. It's available if you Google it. And so one time the police raided Stonewall Inn. And normally when they would raid it, they would disperse the people, and that would be the end of the story. But on this particular day, I think the community there had it up to their ears. They were done with this harassment that they saw. And what they did is that they revolted against the police. They revolted so heavily that the police had to lock themselves inside the inn. They had kicked them out, and these guys were coming back in. And what happened is that a series of riots, known as the Stonewall riots, occurred across New York and various cities in the US. This is significant because it began to rally the people. It began to rally them together as a community. That's the first thing. The second thing that happened was around the 70s. There's a disease that began to afflict a lot of their community. And this disease began to kill very, very many people. And there was great alarm about this disease. At the time, this disease was called GLAAD. And it was affecting many people, so it became a health crisis. Now, it took medical practitioners another year or two to understand that this GLAAD disease was actually affecting heterosexual people as well. And it was then that disease was then called AIDS. If you Google it, that's what it was called initially, gay-related immune deficiency. Why is this significant? Because it began to rally the community once again because they felt under attack, now from a health perspective. Now, the third thing that happened was really the tipping point of the conversation. There was an influential paper called the New York Post. And it must have been 1985, they wrote a very scathing article against gays and the gay community. Now, we need to get rid of our 21st century eyes where we've got the internet and you've got, 100 channels on TV and realize the newspaper was critical for them in terms of spreading message. And this article kind of spread like wildfire. And this really upset the gay community. 1985, what then happens is that the gay community begins to push back. And an organization is born that will forever change their narrative in 1985. That organization is today called GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D. It stands for the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. For me, who's a communication and media person, sometimes I say this and I feel like I'm going to be kicked out of churches. I love the work that these guys have done, and I give context for it. Let me put it this way. I love how they've been able to create a narrative. GLAAD and the LGBT movement have by far the world's best perception change campaign that anyone has ever run. So what is GLAAD? GLAAD is the media advocacy organization of the LGBT movement. And what they began to do is they realized what their struggle was from the 20s until then was they were trying to influence government policy, hoping that will trickle down to the population. What they came to realize in the 80s was that it's not the government that influences public opinions, but it's the media. And GLAAD began to invest extremely heavily in the media. At about the same time, a second group arose, and they're known as the gay mafia. It's a pejorative term, a negative term, or the velvet mafia. And again, you can look this up. What the velvet mafia, what people assume the velvet mafia did, these guys became a cabal who began to infiltrate Hollywood. And they began to infiltrate Hollywood in such a significant way that they would get producers, directors, writers, and actors in their pocket. And as a result, then certain programming would change as a result. The first big breakthrough that the LGBT movement had in as far as media is concerned is a sitcom known as Will and Grace. Do you guys remember Will and Grace? Anyone ever watched Will and Grace?
Yep.
A few dinosaurs here. Okay, sour. So Will and Grace was the first big breakthrough where the LGBT community was finally able to showcase a gay couple on television as central characters. That had not happened before. That was a big breakthrough of theirs. You'll see a quote there. I saw I can't quite read the screen. But Joe Biden, who was the then US vice president, spoke so glowingly about it, and he just talked about how it was one of the most significant moments for the movement. They had a couple of other big breakthroughs following that. And it's interesting because in Hollywood, all these movies became blockbusters. Yeah. All of them featured top A-list celebrity actors. And all of them ended up winning the Oscars. Best movie at the Oscars. Each one of the next movies I'm about to tell you about. The first one is Philadelphia. Anyone know Philadelphia? Philadelphia, Tom Hanks, Denzel Washington. That was a little bit of one of Denzel's older movies. I think you can see it up on the screen. One of the next big ones was a movie called Milk. Anyone know Milk? It's a real story of a guy called Harvey Milk, a US lawyer. It's just me who watches movies here. All right, sour. You guys just watch the Jesus film. I know Chapel are good people. Then there was another really significant one called Brokeback Mountain.
Yeah.
Oh, at least the two of us know that one. We're the two heathens here. All right, sour. So those were some of the breakthroughs they began to have. And this was really significant. It may not seem significant, but it really was for them. Because it began to inform the way that the LGBT media advocacy arm began to engage with communities, with societies, by trying to figure out how do we change perceptions. And as a result, they began to through the years, there are 5 areas that they have begun to influence. 1 is film, and I've talked a little bit about that. 2 is television, and that's another really fascinating story. 3 is advertising, and that one is coming, I'll tell you about it. 4 is social media. And 5 has slipped my mind, is music. With the music scene, if anybody knows, iconic names like Clive Davis or people like that, who are a part of this movement and who really began to push this movement. What I am saying in all of this, guys, if I was just to summarize it, is to say this, is that the LGBT movement, the gay rights movement, has gone through this phenomenal transformation. Because in 1985, they had a thought about how are we going to influence the perceptions of people and how are we going to begin to infiltrate the platforms that influence their thinking.
But is it that media is being influenced, or they're simply reflecting what is going on in our society?
That's such a good question. I get it frequently. Is media just reflecting what's happening in society? I'll give you a theory. I have a couple of theories. I'll give you one of them. 1969, a gentleman called Eric Clark came up with a theory called the theory of representation and minority representation. And what he was saying was that minorities in the media go through 4 phases of representation in the media. The first phase he called non-recognition. I call it refusal. So they all start with R, by the way, for your recollection. But the refusal stage is where the media will not acknowledge a minority at all in the media. I'll give you an example. People living with albinism, you barely see them represented in the media. They're at the non-recognition and the refusal stage. The next stage after that is the representation.
Okay.
The ridicule stage. I don't know why I'm mixing myself up. It's the ridicule stage. The ridicule stage is where you begin to enter into the narrative, but only as a stereotype. So African Americans went through this stage. If you think about it, the representations of blackface, big lips, big bums and all of that. That was years ago in Hollywood, where they went through the ridicule stage. The gay movement as well went through the ridicule stage, where it was all, flamboyance and colors and just making fun of them. Oh, that's such a gay thing you've said. That's the second stage. The third stage is a recognition stage, where media begins to realize that this is actually a significant group and we need to begin to figure out how to work them into the narrative. Again, the African American community went through this because Hollywood began to change perception from African Americans being drug dealers and all those negative stereotypes. And then for a season, from maybe the 90s, a lot of African American superstars, actors, A-listers, began to become law enforcement officers on the big screen. So if you think about a lot of Denzel Washington movies, he's a police officer, he's a good guy. Will Smith movies and people like that, they had entered that stage of recognition. Then the last stage is the stage of respect. And respect is the stage where now we fully respect you. You run your own, you run your own shows, you can run your own studios, tell your own narratives. Why do I tell us about this theory in relation to her question? The LGBT movement, the gay rights movement, has gone through those 4 phases faster than any movement, any civil rights movement ever in the world. If you think about it, the women's rights movement has not reached the space of respect in Hollywood yet.
Yeah.
You're talking about 50% of the population who have been at this for centuries, literally, and still haven't reached that place where they're the ones who are directing, producing, owning studios, at least not en masse. And you have to realize the amount of money that goes into this particular rights organization. Extremely well funded, whether it's the Ford Foundation, Heinrich Boll, whether it's wealthy individuals, but it's extremely well funded. And as a result of that, they have gone through this thing at breakneck speed and pace, more than anybody else. ever before. And I just want to mention one other thing, before I hand over, is I really want to encourage us. Look up GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D. Every year they release a thing they call the Where We Are At report. This report is really about where are we at as a movement, especially on television. That's the one that they focus on a lot in terms of changing perceptions. And what they do is that they actually have a quota. Their goal is to have 10% recurring characters on broadcast and streaming television by I think it's 2022 or 2023. That 10% of all characters are LGBT characters. Just put up that graph if you have it. There's a graph I have there that just shows the growth of what they call recurring characters are characters that appear on every episode. So they may not be the main character, but they're there on every episode. And this shows you the growth from 2005 until about 2017. And that growth has continued. What they have done is put immense pressure on television networks for what they call inclusivity, to make sure that they are represented and represented well, in the media. And sorry, just a final thing, final thing I'll say before I hand over is this, is that one of the things that they did that was, I thought was extremely brilliant, is that they created a narrative of what a gay person should look like on television, how they want a gay person to be represented. If you watch a sitcom, you watch a movie, when you see a gay character, what are their characteristics? Kind.
Colorful, stylish.
Very stylish. Great cook. Best friend to all the ladies. Ladies, you feel me?
Yep.
Let me tell you, that is not coincidental. That is a very intentional narrative that has been created. And it's a persona, a profile that has been created. And right now, I was reading an article by a South African filmmaker, who just talked about how for you to be able to write a script for Netflix today, you must have that profile.
Yeah.
They want the profile included in that. And what I am saying is that, is it media reflecting or is media directing? I think that with the resources, media is now directing the narrative.
Yeah. But let me come back to you, Korea, having studied media and really explained it to us so well and how it shapes narratives. What critical lessons have you learned by just observing media? And also, what are some ideas that even the church can borrow, especially when it comes to pushing narratives? Last question, you have 2 minutes.
Give or take. Because I want to just mention something I forgot to mention before I answer that question. It's the beauty of having the mic.
They're clapping, so I guess they're saying yes.
I was going to mention something. I used to watch this show on television called Designated Survivor. Anyone know that show? There are many heathens here. Excellent. I thought I was alone. You guys just watched the Jesus film. So I used to watch this show, and I quite enjoyed the show. The show was running on what's called network broadcast television, which is like free-to-air television. And at some point, the network said this thing is not profitable, and they cut the show. And that happens to shows all the time. It went off air for a bit, and then it was picked up by Netflix. And then it came back on air, and I thought, okay, let me see. It's been a while. I don't even remember where I was in the story, but let me watch this thing. It was fascinating for me how different the story was.
Yeah.
Completely, it was interesting. All of a sudden, there are random characters, and it's about sexuality, and I'm like, hang on, I've watched this thing for a couple of seasons. I was confused about, it took such a radical right turn. And it's only when I looked it up and I realized that it had moved from broadcast to streaming television that it really, really changed. And the thing about it is that broadcast television, so you're free to air, I think Citizen, KTN, it's driven by advertisers. Advertisers stay away from controversy. They want safe things. Streaming television, your Hulu, Amazon, Netflix, are driven by subscribers. The bar is much lower for subscribers. And the government interference is much lower because you've subscribed to it. So we can give you the content. You know what you have signed up for.
Yeah.
So I just want to mention that about how right now one of the big things is streaming television. On the video on demand is one of the big frontiers. I want to mention 3 others really quickly that I just alluded to earlier. One of them is advertising. Right now, Procter & Gamble and GLAAD have entered into an agreement, $1 million agreement. And Procter & Gamble, you know them. They make what? Always, what do they make?
Cornflakes.
Cornflakes, Oral-B, dental products. There's a ton of things they do. And they've entered into this $1 million agreement with GLAAD for advertising known as the Visibility Project. Just Google it. And the idea is, how do you begin to impact advertising so that there is visibility for the gay rights movement? So what I'll say to you is, begin to watch advertising over the next couple of years. Obviously, it'll take a while to get to this part of the world. But begin to watch the next couple of years. You'll begin to see advertising slowly change.
Maybe even if you could just talk a little bit about how data is collected for advertising, and it can be so specific to ensure that when your 3-year-old child is watching, and they know how to bring it 30 minutes in between, they can bring in an ad and speak specifically to your child according to their language and needs.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we realize being the 21st century, data is power. Data really, that's where the real power is, in data. And with the data collection, even from something like social media, for instance, and you guys will know it if you're on social media, one day you'll be having a conversation about which is the best nail salon. And all of a sudden, those are all the ads that you receive, true or false?
Yep.
And it's a power of data to be able to collect it and to be able to do micro-targeting. Before it was macro-targeting on television. When we put on a billboard, we put a billboard and we're hoping all of you will see it, but only 5 of you may buy. Now it's micro-targeted specifically for whether it's kids, whether it's a particular group of people. So that's a big one. Advertising is definitely going to change. The other 2 really quickly are kids programming. Kids programming has changed and will continue to change, especially on video on demand and streaming platforms. Kids is definitely the next frontier in terms of entering this narrative. Pastor Ondaatje will mention a phrase that I really liked called neuroplasticity, and he'll talk about that. Let me leave that to him. But the idea is, how do you begin to influence from a very young age? Some of you know Batman from the DC universe, comic book, fans and whatnot. You may know that Batman was supposed to be rebooted as a gay character.
Yeah.
And it's only because there was uproar from the comic book fans that they changed it to Batwoman as a lesbian character. And that's targeted at kids. Cartoon Network has Steven Universe and many others. Nickelodeon, The Loud House, Disney. Disney's a big one right now. A lot of money is being pumped into Disney, kids programming, DuckTales, The Owl House. Netflix as well. Anyone grew up watching a show called She-Ra? She-Ra has been rebooted now as a lesbian character. Kipo on the Age of Wonder Beast, The Babysitter's Club. There's so many of them. That's the second one. The third one is social media. Social media now is the final frontier. It's the most difficult one. If you Google the GLAAD Social Media Index, it's a report released by this advocacy arm. And what they do is they look through the different social media platforms to ask themselves, which ones of these are friendly for us and for our movement? It's fascinating, and why I say it's the final frontier is because all the social media platforms failed in the social media index. That's interesting because what it's really saying is, on the social media platform, people are not aligned with the LGBT movement completely. You see, of all the 5, it's the most interactive. And what they said is that social media platforms are unsafe for the LGBT community. However, they are now putting immense pressure, not on the people, but on the owners of the platforms.
Yeah.
And I'll guarantee you that in days to come, even a conversation like this, once it's put up on YouTube,
It might
will
be
be
taken
flagged
down.
and pulled down
Yes.
for harassment and hate speech. That's the language. That's the language that's being used now. So that really is the final frontier in this conversation. But you had asked me another question. 2 minutes, please. Can I answer, please?
That's a yes.
The people have said, what do we do now? I am, by profession, a marketer. By profession. And you guys know the number one law of marketing is the customer
It's right.
is always right. When I studied marketing, my very last lecture in my degree, lecturer walked in and he said something. He said, I'm going to teach you something which you have not been taught in the years you've been doing marketing. This is the real first law of marketing. He said, remove your pens and papers, write this down. So there we are with our, and he said to us this, the customer is an idiot. The marketer is always right. And anyone here who's a marketer, you realize what marketers are in the business of doing is creating demand and creating narratives. If you're here and you have a Samsung phone or an Apple phone, put your hand up. You know, it's interesting because I do as well. And I think I made that decision. I didn't. The decision has been made for me somewhere else and passed down in such a clever narrative of prestige and all of that. Surely, if you have a Xiaomi phone, you will take just as good pictures, true or false?
True.
Do you work there? Maybe you work there. That's why you're cheering. I don't know. But I'm just saying that for me, as I study this narrative, what fascinates me about it is that I wonder, it's such a stage-managed narrative that I wonder whether we're being told the whole story.
Yeah.
There's an image I saw on the internet that I love. Just put up that image of the apple. There's an image that I love. And it's a reflection of the apple. And the person who positions the apple there shows you what they want you to see. This is marketing 101. And you know, for me, when I look, now this is my personal perspective, when I look at this narrative, the question I ask myself is, what don't we know? It's so stage managed that I don't know if it can hold for another 2 generations. At some point, the narrative must be shown, even for the flaws that it has. I'll read you a couple of things and a couple of statistics. All of these are taken from secular, not faith-based, organizations, very credible global organizations, some of them. Psychology Today, psychology publication, a medical publication, says this, that same-sex couples reported shorter relationship lengths than all other couples. Pride Legal, which is actually a document from the gay rights movement, said that gay marriage has a higher divorce rate than any other marriage. The Office of National Statistics in the UK, this is like the Kenya Bureau of Statistics in the UK, this is what they said. Lesbian couples are 2.5 times more likely to get divorced than heterosexual couples. A lady called Sarah Nelson, PhD, who did some fantastic research on this, says this, 2 things. Gay men were 2 to 3 times more likely to have concurrent sexual partners than any other group. She also says that gay men, who at the time of this research, maybe about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, represented 2% of the US population, 2%, accounted for 59% of new HIV infections and 62% of early case syphilis in the US. The final one is the Center for Disease Control. And you may have heard it as we've talked about COVID and whatnot in the US. The Center for Disease Control estimates that HIV and early syphilis rates among gay men are 40 times higher than that for heterosexuals. We've not even talked about the statistics for suicide and depression. And my wife asked me, as I do my last 30 seconds, my wife asked me one day, if our son came up to us and said he was gay, what would we do? And you know, that's the crux of the matter.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know, the first thing you do is you love him. You love him unconditionally. And I think that's a principle that we should have for all the people around us. That we love them unconditionally. Whether we agree with their choices or whether we don't agree with their choices. And I think this is one of the places that where we as a church have really, really struggled. True or false? I think so. Where it's almost like burn, go to hell, you know. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, I apologize on behalf of myself and the church for the times that we have spoken to that community that way. That is not the way to do it. We must love people. But it's a song that's about to be sung. I think it will still be sung. It has a lyric that I love. You must love them to truth. And you must love them to truth. You must have compassion, but you must also have courage. I'll finish with a verse. I'm so sorry. I'll finish with this passage of scripture. It's in Proverbs 7, and it says this. My son, this is Solomon speaking, but it really is God speaking to humanity today. My son, keep my words. Store up my commands within you. Keep my commands, and you will live. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister. To insight, you are my relative. They will keep you from the adulterous woman. What this thing is saying is, God is saying, keep my word central. Not your experiences, not your past. Keep my word central to you. Then the last part of this passage is Solomon standing at the balcony, and he says this. At the window of my house, or the balcony of my house, I looked down, and I saw among the simple, I noticed a young man, a youth who had no sense. He was going down the street near her corner, walking along in the direction of her house. Then out came a woman to meet him, dressed like a prostitute and with crafty intent and with persuasive words. If you read, you'll see the persuasive words she uses. She says to him, I have fulfilled my vows, my husband is away. Really persuasive words. And it closes like this. She says to him, come, let's drink deeply of love till morning. This is the narrative of the sexual revolution. Let's drink deeply of love. Love wins. Love is the greatest. Choose who you want to love. That's the persuasive narrative. With persuasive words, she led him astray and seduced him. All at once he followed her like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose, till an arrow pierced his liver, like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing it will cost him his life. And I think for me, the thing is, as I come with this conversation, I feel we must come with a great deal of compassion. Because there's a generation that's being lost by persuasive words. And that's being driven, pulled in by narratives that they don't even know have power over them. But if we don't speak with courage, out of compassion, we are going to lose an entire generation.